Number 28 Victor, I need runway 30 right and your call sign, please.
38 Victor, or 28 Victor, taxi via Alpha 28 Victor.
Number 28 Victor, runway 30 right and your call sign, please, and verify you have information. Quebec.
3830 Victor and 28 Victor, Quebec.
Number 28 Victor, hold your position, please.
And that audio clip is related to an Archie League Award recently won by 2 air traffic controllers, and we'll tell you more about that incident during the news. Hello, and thank you for joining us for episode 82 of the Aviation News Talk podcast, where we bring you general aviation news and safety tips that pilots and student pilots like you can use. Today, we're talking about when and when not to do S-turns on final, and some of the many landing accidents that have occurred after pilots did S-turns on final. Plus, coming up on the news, a ground controller identifies a pilot who's having trouble taxiing and makes a decision that saves lives. And a passenger on a helicopter tour helps out on the controls after the pilot passes out. And one country has said they'd like to adopt FAA regulations for maintenance instead of the ones used in their country. We'll tell you where that is. And finally, a church pastor in California makes a citizen's arrest of a pilot. It's a bizarre story, and we'll tell you all the details. Welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk about general aviation. I'm Max Trescott. I'm here to educate and inform you and hopefully have a little fun. And along the way, I'll be sharing my over 40 years of experience as a pilot, author of the G1000 Glass Cockpit Handbook, and the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year. I also specialize in Cirrus aircraft like the SR20, 22, and SF-50 Vision Jet. So if you're thinking someday you might be buying one of these aircraft or you want some training in one of them, please call me now. I'll give you a free consultation and possibly can arrange a free demo flight. And if you're new to this show, we typically do a weekly news-oriented show, including listener feedback and answers to questions. And occasionally we do an interview. Last week in episode 81, we talked about what you need to know for a flight review, which was formerly called a BFR. So if you missed that episode, you may want to check it out. All this and more, and the news starts now. From NATCA.org, 2 FAA controllers, Chris Bancroft and Jacques Malou, have both just won Archie League Medal of Safety Awards. On April 27, 2017, the pilot of a single-engine Mooney was taxiing out to runway 30 right for departure at Rocky Mountain Metropolitan Airport, that's BJC, in Denver, Colorado. But something was definitely odd and disturbing about the situation. 8-year veteran air traffic controller Chris Bancroft, working ground control, knew it from the moment the pilot keyed the microphone. During initial and subsequent radio transmissions, Bancroft noticed that the pilot was slurring his speech.
Coming out of the East T hangars with information Quebec, current to 380 right.
We're 782 Victor, I'm at Char, wind 080 at 10. Which runway would you like?
380 is fine.
Number 28 Victor, 38. We don't have a 380. Which runway do you want?
30 is correct, if at all possible.
Number 28 Victor, runway 30 right, taxi via Alpha.
Taxi via Alpha 380.
Number 28 Victor, it's runway 30 right, taxi via Romeo 2 Alpha.
Romeo 2 Alpha, 728 Victor.
Number 782 Victor, I need runway 30 right. Runway 30 right, taxi via Romeo 2 Alpha.
Ground station 0 Alpha 5 signature. 28 Victor.
Number 28 Victor, you got stepped on standby. Hold your position, please. Citation that just exited. Say your call sign.
Yeah, sorry about that. 339 Echo Sierra Alpha 5 taxi signature.
Or 339 Echo Sierra, about to ground run taxi signature via Romeo 3 cross runway 3 at Alpha.
Via Romeo 3 cross runway 3 at Alpha 9 Echo Sierra.
Number 28 Victor, I need runway 30 right and your call sign, please.
38 Victor, or 28 Victor, taxi via Alpha 28 Victor.
Number 28 Victor, runway 30 right and your call sign, please, and verify you have information, Quebec.
3830 Victor and 28 Victor, Quebec.
Number 28 Victor, hold your position, please.
Holding position, 28 Victor.
Number 28 Victor, are you familiar with the airport or have an instructor on board?
28 Victor is somewhat familiar with the airport. Over.
Number 28 Victor, roger, hold your position.
Holding position, 28 Victor.
Number 2A Victor, go ahead and shut down your engine. Airport wanted to talk to you real quick. They're almost out to you.
2A Victor.
The Jefferson County, Colorado Sheriff's Office also responded to investigate what it believed was either a DUI or a medical issue. The pilot, after proceeding to a hangar with his aircraft, was with airport officers when the sheriff's officer arrived. He immediately noticed the pilot's speech was slurred and his eyes were bloodshot and watery. He also could detect the odor of an alcoholic beverage on his breath. Also, his balance was unsteady and he was having difficulty standing. The officer put the pilot through a series of field sobriety maneuvers, which the pilot was unable to complete. The pilot was arrested. The pilot also completed a breath test, the results of which were .207 blood alcohol level. The airport informed the owner of the aircraft that it would be terminating the hangar lease. It was, quote, a great job by both Chris and Jacques, said BJC member and former ATC facility representative Kyle Beamsdorfer, who nominated Bancroft and Malou. He says, who knows how many lives they may have saved that night. And I'd like to extend my congratulations to both of these air traffic controllers who really recognized a bad situation and did something quickly about it. So great job. And here's another great job, this time from a passenger. This comes to us from KITV ABC4 in Honolulu, Hawaii. 2 passengers on board a Robinson R-44 helicopter that crashed on the Hawaiian island of Oahu last week are back home this week in Illinois after being released from the hospital on Tuesday. Chicago news station WGN sat down with the couple on Wednesday and found out that this was their engagement trip. And Monday was their last full day of vacation in Hawaii, and it ended with a trip to the hospital. Somebody wants us to be together, said Adam Barnett, one of the crash survivors. Both Barnett and his fiancée, Carly McConaughey, are reportedly nursing a number of injuries, including broken bones and cuts. They flew home the same day the chopper was lifted out of the bay. The couple told the reporter the whole event was terrifying. Carly said the pilot passed out in mid-flight. She said, first I thought he was kind of playing a bad trick on us. Then when I realized, oh no, he's not waking up, I didn't know what to do. The aircraft was pitching down, and Adam from the back told Carly to pull back on the cyclic control, which she did, and that apparently cushioned their blow into the bay. When they hit the water, Adam said he came to his fiancee's rescue. Quote, about an inch from being underwater, the pilot was passed out on top of her, he said. The 57-year-old pilot survived. His company said he had a previously undiagnosed heart condition and is expected to be released from the hospital in the next day or two. Well, that's a heck of a start for an engagement. Hopefully the marriage is going to be a lot smoother than that. From GeneralAviationNews.com, a long story by Dan Johnson, president of the Light Aircraft Manufacturers Association. And he's saying that the announcement made at the AOPA regional fly-in in Carbondale a couple of weeks ago about changes to the light sport rules, well, they might have come out just a little prematurely and might not have been exactly correct. He said the remarks were made to a gathering regarding changes being contemplated by the FAA. He said, my awareness of this work informed me that the January 19th, 2019 date, barely more than 3 months away at the time it was mentioned, was an impossible deadline. He says, as part of a 4-year-long advocacy project, I've been working with the FAA a couple months earlier and seen the volume of work facing the rule writing staff. I knew they had many months of work ahead of them. He said, I was even more certain the 3,600-pound number was not a specific target for these proposed rules. It was a holiday, but he contacted one of his contacts at the FAA, who immediately got back to him and said yes, that the statements were the result of a misunderstanding. He said the often repeated 3,600-pound number is wrong. Unless a major change occurs, the rule writers plan a formula to arrive at the maximum weight for a particular light sport aircraft. He said it will not be a hard number. In truth, it could be as high as 36 pounds for any particular aircraft. So the speech information was headed in the right direction, but it will not be 3,600 pounds for all LSA, nor does this particular figure deserve such focus. He said, since AOPA fly-in early in the month, EAA has clarified its view of the work underway at the FAA. MOSAIC, as that project is known, is an acronym referring to modernizing rules for LSA and other categories. The Oshkosh-based association also corrected the prognosis for the release date of an NPRM, stating it remains well into the future. From avweb.com comes a story that a new experimental aircraft flight training policy is being proposed. The FAA has proposed a regulatory change that would allow flight training in experimental light sport aircraft, that is ELSA, to be conducted for compensation or hire under a letter of deviation. Aviation organizations including EAA, the Light Aircraft Manufacturers Association, and the United States Ultralight Association have been working toward this policy expansion for some time. Quote, the successful publication of this rule and the accompanying policy change will create new opportunities in ultralight and sport pilot training, said EAA Government Relations Director Tom Charpentier. We see ultralights and light sport aircraft as an increasingly important pathway into aviation, and we are working with the FAA in a variety of ways to remove unnecessary barriers to access. This is one small but important step in that overall process. According to USUA President Roy Beiswanger, this policy was one of the top 4 industry issues identified to the FAA in 2014. EAA says it's working with the FAA to get the rule published as soon as practical. The NPRM notice of proposed rulemaking is open for public comment until November 23rd. From AOPA.org comes word that the FAA has provided a map to off-ramps from special issuance medicals. The FAA has detailed how pilots with a special issuance medical certificate can transition from a first, second, or third class medical and fly as a sport pilot, glider pilot, or under basic med. Some pilots have found it difficult to navigate the transition from special issuance medical certification to alternative medical qualifications such as sport pilot or basic med rules. The solution starts by understanding that the holder of a special issuance has obligations on 2 levels. First, an FAA special issuance authorization letter contains specific terms that the individual must meet to be eligible to apply for and hold a medical certificate. Second, the airman must then be able to pass the examination for a first, second, or third class medical certificate. A recent FAA legal opinion explains that if the pilot's special issuance medical has expired, but the pilot's authorization letter that allows the pilot to seek medicals hasn't, the pilot's ongoing obligation to submit medical information to the FAA ended when the associated special issuance medical certificate expired. Now, AOPA believes that the legal opinion the FAA posted on October 12th addresses some, but not all of the questions. For example, the legal opinion did not take up several ambiguities, such as whether a pilot participating in basic med may surrender an unexpired medical certificate or an authorization for special issuance to resolve any conflicting compliance rules. David Ord, AOPA Senior Director of Regulatory Affairs, said, with more than 41,000 pilots now flying under basic med, it's in everyone's best interest for the transition from traditional medical certificates to be clear and well-defined. And as I have always told all my clients for many years, if you have any questions about your medical, contact AOPA. Of course, you've got to be a member, call their 800 number, and they've got a large staff of people who specialize this who can help you out. From GeneralAviationNews.com comes word that EAA has released its new flight test manual, which brings processes and procedures of professional flight testing to the amateur-built aircraft community. The 47-page manual is a comprehensive program for amateur-built aircraft. It includes outlines for each essential test point, as well as a booklet of 19 test cards that can be carried in the aircraft for quick reference and data collection while in flight. Those test cards are similar to those used by professional civilian and military test pilots. The EAA Flight Test Manual provides the guidance and data collection process to bring simplicity to a flight testing program. It allows pilots to have a full understanding of an aircraft's performance, characteristics, and limitations. The manual is one segment of EAA's work with the FAA to create a new alternative Phase 1 flight testing program using a requirements-based foundation. That could bring a significantly reduced flight test hour requirement in exchange of successful completion of the step-by-step flight testing program, according to EAA. Quote, the accident rate for amateur-built aircraft is at a historic low, but we are relentless in seeking continuing improvements through this education, said Sean Elliott, EAA's Vice President of Advocacy and Safety. From FlyingMag.com, Garmin last week received an FAA Supplemental Type Certificate, or STC, for installation of their GFC 500 autopilot on select Beechcraft Bonanza and Debonair aircraft, including models 33, A33, B33, and a whole bunch of other 33s. They say that some F33, F33C, and G33 serial numbers are excluded from the approval list, but Garmin says it's working on a GFC 500 STC for the F33A Bonanza and expects certification in the coming months. Garmin said the GFC 500 integrates with the G5 electronic flight instrument, or a combination of both the G5 and G500 TXI flight display, to provide pilots with an economical and modern autopilot solution. The autopilot's mode controller contains large dedicated keys and knobs, a control wheel for easy adjustment of aircraft pitch, airspeed, and vertical speed, and a level button, which, by the way, is my favorite feature. That blue button really helps in a lot of different ways. So, for example, when I'm in an aircraft with the level button, if the aircraft is headed in the wrong direction or has climbed through an altitude, the fastest, quickest way to stop things from getting worse, punch the level button, because now you're not going to continue that turn beyond where it's supposed to be, or that climb is not going to continue to get worse. Much better than sitting there dialing knobs trying to fix the problem. So love the level button. Also, Garmin's electronic stability protection, ESP, functions independently of the autopilot and works in the background to help pilots avoid inadvertent flight attitudes or bank angles, and provides airspeed protection while the pilot is hand flying the aircraft. Customers who already own a G5 electronic flight instrument can add the 500 autopilot, beginning at suggested retail price of $6,995 for a 2-axis autopilot. When the GFC 500 is purchased together with the G5 electronic flight instrument, suggested retail prices begin at less than $10,000. And of course, installation costs are not included. In international news from australianflying.com.au, industry feedback shows preference for U.S. maintenance rules. Feedback to CASA's proposal to adopt international maintenance regulations for small GA aircraft has shown overwhelming support for the U.S.'s FARs. The new regulation proposal was announced at the Australian General Aviation Alliance Summit in Wagga Wagga last July by Deputy Prime Minister Michael McCormack, and is intended to simplify maintenance rules for small aircraft involved in private, airwork, and non-passenger charter operations. According to CASA data released yesterday, 78% of respondents to the proposal preferred the FARs over New Zealand, Canadian, or European regulations. Quote, all respondents identified issues with the existing regulations and indicated support for change to a simpler, more understandable set of rules, said CASA. The cost of overregulation and red tape is doing major damage to industry. Many businesses have already succumbed to the current system that lacks definition between CASA functions and requirements and the responsibilities of industry participants. Howard Hobbs, president of the Australian Mooney Pilots Association, said that following the U.S. system would clarify the responsibility of aircraft owners when it comes to maintenance requirements. CASA will now hand the feedback over to a technical working group appointed by the Aviation Safety Advisory Panel to firm up a new policy. More information, including some published feedback, is on the CASA Consultation Hub. And finally, from YourCentralValley.com, a story from CBS 47 and KSEE 24 TV in Fresno, California. The headline is, Hot Air Balloon Lands on a Church's Lawn. The Reverend Makes a Citizen's Arrest. I am not making this up. I'm going to read it straight from their website. A trespass was not forgiven when a hot air balloon made a possible emergency landing on the church's lawn Saturday morning. The landing happened at Family Community Church near Chestnut and Nice Avenues. After making a citizen's arrest, the Reverend did not want to go on camera, but says he's ready to go to court over this unusual incident. Bob Lachlan, balloon director for this year's Clovis Fest, said people want us out flying. They come out and say, wow, this is cool. Neighbors that never met each other get to meet each other. It's really a fun thing. But all the fun is creating some heat after one hot air balloon landed in some hot water with this church. Quote, our officers were patrolling in the area, said Lieutenant Stephen Viveros with the Fresno Police Department. He added, he watched it land, and as it was landing, he was flagged down by someone from the church asking to have the pilot of the air balloon cited for trespassing. Viveros said the church leaders made a citizen's arrest claiming the balloon landed during the start of a funeral. Quote, the pilot said he was not aware that it was a no-landing zone. Had he known, he would not have landed there, according to Viveros. The church has private property signs on display, but the Clovis Fest balloon director says their pilot had to make a possible emergency landing in the church field as they were close to running out of fuel. Quote, I understand maybe there was a funeral going on, and I'm sorry if we had any disruption there, Lachlan said. The FAA said the incident was not reported to them. As for the pilot, police said he could face fines and a misdemeanor charge for trespassing. Well, this really highlights the special challenges that balloon pilots sometimes encounter. There is a follow-up story, and it's according to the station's Family Community Church released the following statement. It's a long one. I'll just pick out a couple of lines from it. It says, we have repeatedly requested that hot air ballooning community not land on our property, primarily for safety and legal reasons. They say church staff did not call for law enforcement. Law enforcement was already following the hot air balloons in the area. Therefore, they were on site when the balloon landed on our property. Law enforcement became involved in the incident and cited the pilot only after the pilot and the other members of the group refused to leave the church property. The pilot was not cited for landing on the property, but cited after he was asked politely by church staff multiple times to remove his equipment from the property, and he refused. They say we support the spirit of Clovis Fest as a celebration of international cultures, which aligns with the work of our international ministry. And in the coming days, the church welcomes the opportunity to start a dialogue with the city of Clovis, its Chamber of Commerce, to discuss ways we can work together to make future events more successful without violating the church's property rights or FAA regulations. Well, that's the news for this week. Coming up, you may occasionally find yourself doing S-turns on final just before landing, but are you aware of the number of accidents that happen doing this? Just what is the procedure that's spelled out for how to do an S-turn on final? Stick around because we'll be right back here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And welcome back. In a few minutes, we'll get to our main topic on S-turns, but first, let me give you a few quick updates like this one about our annual listener survey. This is your opportunity. Don't pass it up. This is a chance for you to help guide the show. For example, is there a topic you'd like to hear about that you think is important and that other pilots could also benefit from hearing about? Well, take the survey and let me know. Or maybe there's some little thing I do each week that just drives you crazy. If that's the case, take the survey and let me know. I mentioned this at the very end of last week's show. This week, I'm going to mention earlier in the show so that hopefully everyone hears about it. So I want to thank everyone who has taken the survey so far. If you haven't done it, please take a couple of minutes. Just type it into a web browser, aviationnewstalk.com/survey. And I'll also put a link to it in the show notes so you could tap on the artwork of your podcast player on your smartphone and get to it that way. Thanks very much. I love hearing from everybody, and it's particularly helpful to hear about what topics you'd like to hear me talk about. And I'd like to give you an update on the AOPA Regional Fly-In held down at Gulf Shores, Alabama last weekend. I was there. There was a good crowd there. I would say it was probably more people there than at any of the other prior regional fly-ins around the country this year. So that's great. Weather was kind of interesting. As I was driving there on Thursday, I went through this hellacious rainstorm. Of course, a big storm had just swept through that particular area. But skies were clear on Friday. I gave my presentation 3 hours in the afternoon talking about advanced IFR with modern GPSs, and boy, good crowd. And afterwards, I want to thank a number of listeners who came up and talked with me for about a half hour after the presentation. So one of them was Tyler. He's in the Air Force. He's currently teaching in T6s. He's a CFI, which sounds like great fun. He's originally from my neck of the woods out here in California. He's from San Carlos, and he also did a tour with the Travis Air Force Base, which is just north of San Francisco here, where they have huge flying gas tankers. So those are great things to avoid when you're up there flying. Also talked with Dan. He's a mechanical engineer, and he had a suggestion here. He said we should talk about mountain flying. So I put that on the list here and probably try and find an expert on that. I do a lot of mountain flying, but I think it would be fun to talk to someone who does even more than I do. And finally, we talked with John. John's from New Orleans, and he's a brand new private pilot, and he hung out with us for a while. So, hey, thanks to you and all the other listeners who came up and said hello to me while I was at Gulf Shores. It was really great to get a chance to meet with you. Now, I did decide to head out early on Saturday afternoon. I didn't stay for the entire show, and that's because I wanted to get home Saturday night. But I also wanted to first stop and visit the USS Alabama and the USS Drum. The former is a battleship, and the latter is a submarine. Now, I've been on two different aircraft carriers before, but I have never been on either a battleship or a submarine. And wow, all I can say is it was really, really great doing self-guided tours of both of these, both the ship and the boat. So here's a clip I made after I walked through the USS Drum submarine. I'm aboard the USS Drum submarine. Some of the key takeaways are that this is an incredibly narrow boat. Some of the passageways are barely wide enough for even one person to walk down the length of the ship. The hatches, as you go through one bulkhead to another, are so small that it's hard to imagine anybody running through them. They're probably less than 3 feet high, and for a guy who's 6 feet tall, it's a little tough getting through them. Same with the conning tower. Conning tower is extremely tight, difficult to make it up and down that ladder. So the overall net impression was, oh my gosh, what small quarters for people to have to live for 60 to 75 days when they were out on patrol in World War II. So it really was quite amazing to actually get inside and, see the torpedo tubes in the forward room, the engine room, all kinds of interesting things. But holy cow, not much space in there. Next, I went out and walked through the USS Alabama battleship. That's just the exact opposite. The contrast couldn't be greater. Here's a recording I made there. I'm walking on the deck outside on the USS Battleship Alabama. It's just amazing history. And yet it's so peaceful here with the waves just lapping up very gently here on the outskirts of Mobile Bay. Quite a sight. I recommend anybody who gets a chance to tour this, come do this sometime. It is truly a city afloat. I've walked past doctors' offices, bakeries, sleeping quarters, radio room, engineering quarters, blacksmith shops. Inside the gun turret, the large 16-inch guns, where we can see the huge 2,700-pound projectiles that stood about 5 feet high. Could be fired at a distance of about 21 miles from the ship. Anyway, it's truly amazing. I recommend anybody come visit this. And I concluded if I were on a battleship, I would want to be a radio operator. Of course, many years have been a ham radio operator, and just looking at the rows and rows and rows of radios lined up just certainly had me interested in being, there turning the knobs and talking over the radio. I did want to tell you it's called the USS Alabama Battleship Memorial Park. You couldn't find an easier place to get to. It's right off of Interstate 10. So if you're driving across the southern states of the U.S. here on Interstate 10, this is a must-see stop as you go by Mobile, Alabama. And what I haven't talked about is the large number of aircraft they had there, because I didn't have time to stop and look at them. They probably had at least a couple of dozen aircraft, both outside the facility and inside a large building. I did take a quick photograph of a B-52, which was out in the parking lot area there. Let's see what else. I also saw an SR-71 Blackbird outside as well, and then just many, many, many other aircraft. So anyway, it was a great stop. And from there, I drove back to New Orleans, where I caught my flight back to San Francisco, and it was nice to get home Saturday night. And one of the reasons I wanted to get back is I had 3 flights scheduled on Sunday with different clients. One of them was kind of memorable. We walked out to a Cessna 172, and this is the last person I have that's still flying something other than a Cirrus. He's 15 years old. He's been flying these aircraft for quite a while, and so he's my only non-Cirrus client at this point in time as I've transitioned. But when we got out to the 172, we noticed there were a couple people who were securing another 172 right next to it. And one of the gentlemen came over to tell me that when they pushed that aircraft back, they had banged the wing of their aircraft into the wing of our aircraft. So I spent some time looking at both aircraft. And sure enough, I could find a big scratch on the wingtip on the top of our airplane, which had been caused by the black shield that hangs down on newer Cessna 172s right out at the wingtip to prevent the strobe lights from blinding the pilots of that particular aircraft. And that little black strip must be metal, because it left a pretty distinct scratch on the top. To me, it didn't look like anything other than kind of cosmetic paint. We went ahead and flew the aircraft. But I have to mention that just before we were starting our aircraft, these 2 gentlemen were still out, at their airplane, and I gave a very loud clear, letting them know that we were about to start the engine. And a couple of seconds later, what do? They walked directly behind the tail of our aircraft, and I just kind of had to shake my head. It's like, if somebody is starting an aircraft, you really don't want to be immediately behind that airplane. If for no other reason, it's probably going to blow some dirt and some other stuff in your eyes. And I certainly walk very far behind aircraft that are either running or about to start. But anyway, it just kind of let me know that, okay, these pilots may be a little bit clueless this. Not only did they smack the airplanes together, but they just weren't paying attention to the fact that we were about to start our aircraft. So, oh well, what can I say? There's a bell curve of pilots, just like there is the rest of the population. And these guys were definitely on the far left side of the bell curve. And I just want to call your attention to an error that I made last week in episode 81. Ted from Fort Collins, Colorado pointed it out, and I had actually just heard it as I was in the car going to the airport to fly to Gulf Shores. So, of course, it was too late for me to fix it at that point. This was our episode where we were talking about the flight review, or BFR, and in it I said incorrectly that if you are over uncongested areas that you must maintain a height of, well, I'm not going to repeat what I said, but the correct answer is 500 feet. So anytime you're over congested areas like cities, it's going to be 1,000 feet above the highest obstacle within 2,000 feet horizontally. Uncongested areas, you got to be 500 feet above the ground. And of course, if you're in unpopulated areas, it's got to be at least 500 feet horizontally from any person's vessels, vehicles, or a structure. So my apologies on that. My rough calculation is I probably have 12,000 words in a typical 1-hour show, and I got one wrong. Sorry about that, folks. But that's the price I pay for sometimes doing these shows after midnight. And let me mention a couple quick things that I saw on Twitter during the past week. And if you're on Twitter and you're not following me, just go ahead and look for Max Trescott, all one word, on Twitter, MAXTRESCOTT. Go ahead and follow me if you would. And Jennifer out of the Midwest, she works at a major airport there. She had been listening to the radio, and what she overheard was a conversation between a Southwest pilot and their ops people. And what she reported was that a passenger accidentally took her husband's keys with her on a flight to Fort Myers from that Midwest airport. Rather than leaving her to deal with the problem on her own, Southwest flew them back on the next flight. And she said, nice. And I thought that was kind of cute. And I actually retweeted that, and I said that Southwest saved a marriage. So anyway, that was kind of fun. And the other story was really interesting. This was a tweet from EAA talking about a story that was posted on their website, and I'll put a link to that here in the show notes so you can get to it. But it shows the importance of flying young people. So I know some of you fly Young Eagles, so teenagers, part of the EAA program, and that really has an incredibly important effect for motivating teens to choose a career in aviation. So this particular story is written by Alan Bernard and also by Renee Brilhant, who's the teenager, or she was the teenager that he flew years ago. He wrote, all those flights, all those kids, was it worth it? I often wonder after scores of Young Eagle flights. He says that last year I heard a story that made it all worthwhile. One of my Young Eagle flights included an interested nearly 13-year-old girl named Renee Brilhante. I took her up along with another young person. Renee was in the front seat. As I always did, I talked to the kids about what we were doing and how we were doing it. And if the child seemed savvy, I would give them the yoke and guide them through a bit of flying the airplane all by themselves. Well, he goes on and says that, that he had no way of knowing that this would be anything but, unremarkable. But then the story picks up from Renee some 13 years later. She says that my first flight confirmed that I was destined to be a pilot, and from there I hit the ground running to become the best fighter pilot and later test pilot the world had ever seen. The big question was how to afford it. To any future pilot, this is the best advice I can give. Apply for every scholarship out there, start working, become an airport bum, and never stop learning. I used scholarships from the beginning, and at 15 I began flying gliders at the CAP's Flight Academy in Ephrata, Washington, with a full ride until I soloed. The following year, I flew in Cessnas to solo once again with a scholarship, making my total expense $250. So that shows you, what scholarships can do, and also just hanging out at airports and looking for every opportunity to fly. She said that she got a Navy ROTC scholarship to Jacksonville University, and that under the mentorship of a former Air Force pilot and current FedEx pilot who was also granted a height waiver, and apparently she was not tall enough to be able to fly for the Navy. She spent countless hours with her mentor on phone calls, letters, meetings, workouts, and so on. Unfortunately, she was not able to get the waiver. She did go on to serve on board of a ship, which she said the best thing about was that it gave her time to work as a CFI part-time in the Hampton Roads area, which would be down the Tidewater section of Virginia. She says, now I'm a pilot for Republic Airlines, flying routes for American, Delta, and United. I love that more than I imagined, and I'm honored to be a part of a wide range of lives while they fly to anything from vacations to deployments. More great news. I just purchased my first aircraft, a Pitt Special S-1D. And then Alan Bernard wraps up the article and says, okay then, has it all been worth it? All those flights, all those kids, all the time and energy? You be the judge. For me, it doesn't get any better than this. And so I think that's just an absolute key formula. Please, if you're a pilot, go out there and share your love of aviation with a teenager and help them get hooked on it too. And hey, by the way, if you're enjoying this show and you're looking for just a little bit more after you get done listening, head on out to our Patreon site. I post lots of things out there every week, some of which make it onto the show later, some of which don't. So go ahead, check it out. Just go to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome and then click on post, where you can see all the things that I've posted for readers there. And you don't have to be a member to read many of the posts. So go out and take a look. But of course, while you're out there, if you'd like to send a few dollars our way, it's very easy to do, to set it up so that your credit card gets billed. Some people also make donations through PayPal. If you want to do that, just go to aviationnewstalk.com, click on contact at the top of the page, send me a note. I'll let you know how to do that. And I do want to thank our two new Patreon supporters this week, who are Paul Peterson and Robert Seghetti. Thanks so much for being supporters of the show. And I want to thank everybody who supports the show in any way, and sometimes that includes leaving reviews for us or sending feedback, doing things like that. So thanks so much. Really appreciate all your support for the show. So now stick around, because in 7 seconds, we're going to talk about what to do when you're on final and there's just not enough space between you and the plane in front of you. And we'll talk about why S-turns on final, not such a great option, right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And welcome back. So sometime in your flying career, you're going to find yourself in a situation where you're in the traffic pattern to land, but you just don't have as much distance as you would like between you and the plane that's landing in front of you. And unless you fly only at deserted airports, well, most pilots run into this problem at some point. The problem is really common at busy airports, so much so that I encounter the issue almost every time I fly. And over the years, I've developed a number of tricks for spacing myself out. And these days I do it pretty well, and I'm almost never in a position where I'm too close to the plane in front of me and have to go around. And I'm also flying in a faster airplane in the traffic pattern. So I want to share some of these tips with you. Now, I was prompted to talk about this because this past weekend I watched an aircraft doing S-turns on short final, and it really bothered me. It's probably been years since I've done an S-turn on final to increase spacing with an aircraft in front of me, and I've never really liked the technique. But I started wondering afterwards, well, am I becoming an old fuddy-duddy? Because after all, lots of pilots are doing S-turns on final at my airport to increase spacing, and often it's the tower that will tell a pilot to do S-turns for spacing. So is there really anything wrong with doing S-turns on final? But the big issue in my mind was, is it safe? And are there more accidents when pilots do S-turns on final to increase separation? And if so, is there data to back up my instinct, which has always been that doing S-turns on final is not a great idea, and it's probably less safe than other options. But that brings us back to the original question. If you find yourself too close to the plane in front of you, how do you increase the separation between yourself and the plane in front of you without doing S-turns? Now, there are a lot of ways to increase separation without doing S-turns, but first, let's talk about what's wrong with doing S-turns on final, and then we'll talk about other solutions. Now, every tower controller knows that the tower is responsible for assigning sequence. So in other words, you're number 1, you're number 2, you're number 3, and the pilot is responsible for the separation between his or her plane and the plane in front of them. So if the pilot is responsible for separation, why do towers sometimes issue instructions to airplanes to do S-turns for spacing? Because that's a separation issue. I've always joked that all pilots seem to want to be controllers and all controllers seem to want to be pilots. And to me, a controller telling pilots to do an S-turn to increase separation, well, that's just a perfect example of a controller kind of muscling in on a pilot's responsibility for separation. Not that pilots and controllers don't help each other out with timely suggestions, but here is the more important question. Does the controller rulebook, which specifies everything they're supposed to do and not supposed to do, authorize them to instruct pilots to make S-turns on final? And if not, why do they give pilots instructions to make S-turns, and why do pilots follow those instructions? And what about the pilots? How do they know what to do when they make S-turns on final? Were they trained to make S-turns on final by their instructors while getting a private pilot's license? I'm guessing most of them weren't. And if a CFI does teach a client how to do S-turns on final, is that permitted? Or is that malpractice on the part of the CFI? Since I started wondering about this, I've researched answers on all of these things and found out answers to most of them, so stay tuned. Now, the first thing that struck me while watching the aircraft doing S-turns on Sunday was that it was by definition an unstable approach. Way back last year in episode 27, we talked about the definition of unstable approaches and how to fly a stable approach. And back then I said, so what is a stabilized approach and why does it matter? The Cirrus Aircraft Flight Operation Manual gives the best description I've seen. It says, quote, a stabilized approach is characterized by a constant angle and constant rate of descent approach profile ending near the touchdown point. Stabilized approach criteria apply to all approaches, including practice power-off approaches. It goes on to say that for VFR landings, quote, an approach is considered stabilized when all of the following criteria are achieved by 500 feet AGL. Proper airspeed, correct flight path, correct aircraft configuration for phase of flight, appropriate power setting for aircraft configuration, normal angle and rate of descent, and they say that only minor corrections are required to correct deviations. A go-around must be executed if the above conditions are not met and the aircraft is not stabilized by 500 feet AGL. Now, the aircraft I watched definitely didn't meet the criteria for correct flight path below 500 feet. And I know this because while I was watching it, I pulled up the traffic page in the aircraft that I was in, and both the plane that I was in and the one making the S-turns was equipped with ADS-B in and out. And I took a couple of pictures of the screen with my iPhone. The first picture I took showed that the S-turning plane was at 400 feet and it was at 1.1 miles away. The runway to our airport is 3.1, or about 310 degrees magnetic. And the first photo showed that the aircraft was on a ground track of 257 degrees, or about 50 degrees left of the runway at a ground speed of 79 knots. Now, according to the METAR, there was about a 12-knot wind at the time. So the true airspeed the aircraft was flying was about 90 knots versus a final approach speed in that plane of 80 knots. The second photo I took showed that the aircraft was at 300 feet and was now about 3/4 of a mile from the threshold on a ground track of 012, or about 60 degrees to the right of the runway. It was still at a ground speed of 79 knots, or about 90 knots true airspeed. Now, clearly this aircraft violated the definition of a stable approach, as the aircraft was not on the correct flight path or at the proper airspeed, and they were well below 500 feet AGL. But the pilot landed safely, so the obvious question is, does it matter? Now, on one level, it didn't matter because the pilot landed safely. But on another level, it reinforced for this pilot and for everyone watching and for the tower controller that this was an acceptable practice because everything turned out okay. But pilots can often get away with something for hundreds of times before it finally bites them that one time when things don't work out. And it can cost them their lives or, at a minimum, damage to an aircraft. So the question is, do some pilots fail to execute the S-turn on final maneuver properly and then go on to have accidents? But before we talk about accidents, notice that I call this S-turn on final a maneuver. Well, that was said tongue-in-cheek. It is not a maneuver. A maneuver is something that's well-defined, has performance standards, and is taught in a consistent, standard way. Think about the maneuvers you did to get a pilot's license. Steep turns, that's a maneuver, and you knew that you had to perform it at least 1,500 feet above the ground. The bank angle had to be held at 45 degrees plus or minus 5 degrees for the private certificate, and you had to maintain altitude plus and minus 100 feet. Now, that's very clearly defined, and definitely it's a maneuver. But wait, you say, hey, I had to do S-turns when I got my private certificate, so that's a maneuver too, right? Well, yes, there is a ground reference maneuver called S-turns, and it has performance standards too. And they include flying a complete 180-degree turn, followed by another 180-degree turn in the opposite direction, while maintaining airspeed plus or minus 10 knots and altitude plus or minus 100 feet. And those S-turns must be performed between 600 and 1,000 feet AGL. Also, pilots are generally looking out the window at that point on the ground where their wing is pointed, as they're essentially doing a half turn around a point. Now, does that sound anything like an S-turn you've seen on final? Yeah, probably not. When pilots are S-turning on final, they're rarely going to turn a full 180 degrees left and right, and they're often descending as they do S-turns on final. And in the case I've just mentioned, the pilot was at 300 feet AGL, which is way below the 600 feet specified as the minimum for doing S-turns on a private check ride. So I think we can all agree the S-turn on final, it's not the same maneuver that pilots are taught for the private certificate. Pilots are taught specific ways to fly, and most pilots can describe, for example, the traffic pattern that they fly with great precision. But they don't have any specific guidance on S-turns for final. So, for example, if you were doing an S-turn on final, what's the bank angle you're going to use? Is it 20, 30, 45 degrees? And how long do you continue to turn off the center line? 30 degrees off the runway heading, 45 degrees, 60 degrees off the runway heading? And how much extra speed should you add for the increase in stall speed that occurs as an aircraft is banked in a turn? And just how much distance will this create between you and the aircraft in front of you, especially if you have to increase speed because of higher stall speeds? And will that space created be enough, or will you still have to go around? Finally, if this were some kind of normal maneuver, it's got to be referenced somewhere by the FAA. And I've recently done an extensive search, and I can tell you that the Airplane Flying Handbook, which is the FAA's book that tells pilots how to fly an airplane, has no reference in it anywhere to flying S-turns on final. But what about controllers? What guidance did they have for issuing instructions to pilots to fly S-turns? Now, controllers are governed by a huge book that details everything they're allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do while they're performing their job. It's called the FAA JO Order 7110.65W Air Traffic Control. Now, I've referred to this document a few times in the past when I've had a question, and I did a thorough search of it again. And guess what? The term S-turn, it does not appear anywhere in that document. So there is absolutely zero guidance in that document that tells the controller that they are allowed to issue an instruction to fly S-turns on final. Now, there's a separate document that's intended to make sure that pilots and controllers are speaking the same language, and it's an excellent document if you haven't seen it. It's called the Pilot Controller Glossary. And yes, you may have already guessed, the word S-turn does not appear in that document either. In fact, if you were to search the entire FAA website, there are virtually no references to flying S-turns on final. Now, there was one reference that was very germane, and thank goodness for search engines, because if I had thought to look for this document, I never would have gone to it to look for information on S-turns on final. But just as controllers have their own handbook, FAA inspectors also have a handbook. The current one is Order 8900.1 Flight Standards Information Management System, and it replaces the old 8700.1 General Aviation Operators Inspection Handbook. And if you were to go into Volume 6, Chapter 1, Section 5, it's called Surveillance of a Certificated Flight Instructor. What it says there is objective. This task determines whether a certificated flight instructor, or CFI, continues to perform to the same standards of the original certification. It says there should be some random surveillance of flight instructors, but it also says an inspector should take appropriate action anytime there is a justifiable public complaint directed toward a CFI. For example, if a CFI is involved in an accident or incident, a student pilot instructed by the CFI is involved in an accident or incident. And below that, they've got the section which I think is really critical. 6-123, it's called Special Emphasis Items. So that means these are the things that are most important to do when they're surveilling CFIs. It says the following paragraphs provide information for ASIs, that would be the aviation safety inspectors, the FAA inspectors, to consider when conducting surveillance of flight instructors. A, dangers associated with non-standard, unstabilized landing approaches. Although not a widespread practice, instructors occasionally teach non-standard procedures. The FAA considers these procedures non-standard because they do not adhere to the POH or the AFM, the approved flight manual. This practice contributes to instructional accidents. Witnesses to one fatal instructional accident observed the aircraft on short final performing S-turns with bank angles between 30 and 45 degrees. After several S-turns, the aircraft nosed down abruptly and struck the ground about 600 feet short of the runway. The instructor taught the use of S-turns on final approach to increase the spacing between the aircraft and the traffic pattern. The high bank angles used in this accident could have significantly increased the stall speed. Light aircraft POHs, or AFMs, include information on the effect of high angles of bank on stall speed, as well as recommended airspeeds for approach and landing. Subsequent investigation disclosed that the instructor used non-standard techniques and procedures contrary to safe operating practices. Section B says adherence to established procedures. To ensure that instructors teach the proper procedures that lead to a safe approach and landing, ASIs must discuss the following areas with instructors: the importance of adhering to procedures specified in the appropriate POH or AFM, the importance of properly instructing small aircraft pilot applicants in standard traffic patterns for a stabilized approach and landing, and emphasis there on stabilized. That's my emphasis. We were just talking about unstable approaches. And ensuring a normalized descent to the runway touchdown zone by establishing there's this word again, stabilized flight path using appropriate power settings, airspeed, and sink rates. So this should all be pretty clear. If you're a CFI and you're teaching pilots to make S-turns on final, guess what? You are violating a special emphasis item that FAA inspectors are trained to look for when surveilling CFIs or investigating an accident. So I don't think it could be any clearer. Any flight instructor who's teaching S-turns on final is violating the rules because they're teaching an unstable approach. Now, to be fair, there were 2 other references on the website to making S-turns in the traffic pattern. One of them, which was a human factors research document, said that while flying on downwind, one could use shallow S-turns if necessary to maintain spacing with other aircraft. But they said this was to be done before beginning a descent abeam on the runway. In other words, it was to be done on downwind. Doesn't say anything about using S-turns on final. And finally, there was a presentation called Aeronautical Decision Making for Instructor Pilots that said it was a joint project of AOPA and FAA in 1987. In a training scenario 48, it said corrective action should be taken, such as decreasing airspeed, S-turns on final, or a go-around. Now, that document is 31 years old, and it directly contradicts Order 8900.1, which we just discussed, which is a much more recent document. But let's get back to the original question. Do S-turns on final matter? Do they lead to landing accidents? And the answer to that is an unequivocal yes, they do cause accidents. I did a quick search of the NTSB database, and just in a very short time, I found 28 accidents that are related to people who were using S-turns on final. In addition, there were many more accidents that I didn't include where the S-turns weren't really relevant to the accidents. For example, there were multiple cases where a pilot had engine problems and was doing S-turns on final and subsequently had an accident. I didn't include those because, to me, those were engine failure related. Now, as I was going through the accidents, I was absolutely shocked. The very first accident I found was at my home airport. It says that on November 18th, 2005 at 10:30 a.m., a Cessna 210R airplane overran the runway 31 and impacted a perimeter fence during an aborted landing at Palo Alto Airport in California. The airplane sustained substantial damage, and the pilot and 3 passengers were not injured. The airline transport pilot was operating the plane under provisions of Part 91. VMC conditions prevailed, and a flight plan was not filed. The flight originated from Laverne, California at 8:10 a.m. was destined for Palo Alto. According to the pilot's written statement, the air traffic controller asked him to conduct S-turns to provide spacing for a departing airplane. The pilot complied with the request, but ended up landing long on the 2,400-foot runway. He elected to abort the landing due to the lack of remaining runway, however, was unable to accelerate enough to take off. The airplane overran the end of the runway and impacted a perimeter fence. The pilot indicated there was nothing wrong with the airplane. His total flight experience consisted of 22,400 flight hours, of which 280 hours were accumulated in the accident aircraft make and model. So imagine that. You've got a 22,000-hour pilot, very experienced, and yet he gets destabilized by doing S-turns and overruns the runway. Here's another one from Kentucky, coincidentally also Cessna 210. It says, while on a straight-on approach to the runway, the pilot was advised by the tower that there was another plane in front of him and to perform S-turns for spacing. 2 witnesses then saw the aircraft begin a nose-high left turn, then saw the left wing dip. One of the witnesses, a pilot waiting for departure, noted that the airplane was in the landing configuration with landing gear and flaps extended. It appeared that the airplane did not increase airspeed, yet the more it turned, the steeper the bank of angle became. The witness said that the plane entered a spin with the left wing low and the right wing high. The airplane made 1.5 revolutions before disappearing below a tree line. So it looks like in this case, S-turns directly led to an aircraft entering a spin. And of course, the pilot was killed. Now, here's one that killed 2 people in a 152 in Palm Springs, California. It says, while on base leg, turning to final approach at the desert airport, the instructional flight was authorized by the air traffic control tower to perform S-turns for spacing due to another aircraft stopped in position on the runway and starting the takeoff roll. Witnesses observed the aircraft wings rock steeply right and left, and then the aircraft dove nose first to the ground from 250 feet AGL. So the list of these accidents goes on and on. I could spend an hour reading all of them to you, but I think you probably get the idea. So why am I telling you all of this? Because these kinds of accidents do happen, and nobody talks about the dangers of doing S-turns on final. So if you do them, you are doing so at your own peril. Now, to sum up the main idea here, S-turns on final, it's not an approved maneuver. There are no standards for how to perform it. Doing it does cause accidents, some of which are fatal, and CFIs who teach people to do S-turns on final are a specific target of FAA surveillance of flight instructors. So, how do you safely create space between you and an aircraft in front of you? If you're already on final when you realize that you're too close, you've got relatively few good options at that point other than going around, which is the safest, most prudent thing to do. If it's a long final, you could immediately reduce your speed to the short field landing speed for your aircraft, but that may not be enough, especially if the plane in front of you is of a type that has a slower landing speed than your aircraft type. Now, if there's no one behind you, you could always make a 360-degree turn. If you're at a towered airport, you're going to need permission from the tower before doing that. And if you're at a non-towered airport, well, there's no way to be absolutely sure there's no one behind you. So doing a go-around is going to be much safer than doing a 360 on final at a non-towered airport. But I find if you want to create separation between you and the aircraft in front of you, the best way to do that is to plan ahead and start taking action earlier, ideally long before you turn on to final. For example, if I'm in the traffic pattern doing touch and goes and I'm following a slower aircraft, I'll extend my upwind leg right after takeoff, and I won't turn crosswind until I have more separation from the aircraft in front of us. And if that aircraft is still too close, when I go to turn base, I'll continue my downwind further than normal before I turn base, which will create even more space between the airplanes. Also, there's often an opportunity to create just a little extra space on the base to final turn. It doesn't work in a tight close-in pattern, but at my home airport, I'm often instructed to turn base about 2.5 miles from the airport, and this works well in situations like that when you're turning onto a long final. I simply overshoot the turn to final very slightly, and then I make a slow turn back onto final. And yes, it's 1/2 of an S-turn, but I'm doing it at 800 feet above the ground and at a very shallow bank. And I have a full 2.5 miles to get aligned with the runway, so it's relatively safe and does create some extra space. And there's a huge missed opportunity for creating space that I see pilots fail to do all the time. Just drives me crazy. And it's so simple. All you have to do is immediately after you turn final, reduce to final approach speed. Now, if you're flying a faster plane like a Cirrus, a Mooney, or Bonanza, this one simple idea can make all the difference between being able to land and having to go around. Yet somehow, many pilots seem to have the idea that they can go any speed they want on final, and then they wait till the very end to slow up to approach speed at the last minute. And by then, it may be a little bit too late because they've caught up with the aircraft in front of them. Not only that, they may be once again violating the principles of a stable approach, which, among other things, says that you're at approach speed before descending below 500 feet AGL. Also, if you're waiting until the last minute to slow down, you may have to pull the power completely off, which can lead to a high descent rate, which is also a characteristic of an unstable approach. Now, another technique I'll sometimes use is to fly a somewhat wider downwind than the one being flown by the aircraft in front of me. That way I'll have a longer base leg, which does create a little additional separation. And the absolute best tool for managing the separation between you and the plane in front of you is to have an in-cockpit traffic display, preferably ADS-B in. And most of the time I'm flying with a traffic display, and I almost always know what my sequence in the pattern is going to be even before the controller tells me, because I can see all of the traffic that's ahead of me in the pattern. And more importantly, I have a pretty good idea of the distance between my plane and the plane in front of me. Now, I'm almost always in a Cirrus, and it's faster than many of the airplanes in the pattern, so I always try to have about 2 miles of separation in the pattern between me and the plane in front of me. And on final, if that separation reduces to 1.5 miles, well, I still have a pretty good chance of being able to land, even if the aircraft in front of me is making a full stop landing. If it's much less than 1.5 miles, then there's a good chance I'll have to go around. So in summary, I don't do S-turns on final, because they add unneeded risk to flying at one of the most critical stages of flight, which is, of course, the approach to landing phase. I still remember the very first time a controller told me to make S-turns on final. I was a little surprised that he said that, and I wasn't sure exactly what to do, and I kind of faked my way through it, assuming that, well, this somehow must be an acceptable thing because a controller told me to do it. Boy, my views changed over the years. I just don't do S-turns. They're destabilizing. You don't need to do them. Especially if you plan ahead and use the techniques I described, you can create the separation long before you arrive on final. And that way you don't have to do S-turns. But if I were to do an S-turn on final, for me it would have to be at the very beginning of a very long final, as I want to be done doing the S-turns before I descend below 500 feet AGL, which means I'm probably at least 1.5 miles from the runway. And if a tower controller instructed me to make S-turns, I would probably just ask for a 360 instead. And if a 360 weren't possible, I'd just go around. Remember, you can always go around. And doing so is a lot safer than flying S-turns on final. Coming up next, lots of listener feedback. A couple from pilots who share things that they wish their instructors had taught them as student pilots, but which they had to figure out later on. We'll be right back. And welcome back. Before we get to listener feedback, just a couple quick thank yous for people who have left reviews. These come from folks who left reviews in the Apple Podcast app, which was formerly called iTunes. PW Brewer says he's about 5,400 hours of flying time, and he says he could attest there is never enough knowledge, and that he really likes keeping up on new trends with this podcast. So thanks so much for that, PW Brewer. And here's one from someone I was actually able to figure out who it is. I'll tell you in just a moment. This comes from The Fishing Weatherman. He says it's a must for anyone interested in GA. And he says, I started listening to this podcast as an aspiring CFI to bring myself back up to speed in the aviation world. If you're looking to do the same or to stay up to date, this podcast is a must. I've been a broadcaster for 30 years and can honestly say Max Truscott has great production values and does a great job organizing content and providing a variety of content in his episodes. No, this is not from my mom. I'm sure she would say things just as good. But The Fishing Weatherman, I did a quick search. Turns out it's Chris Dunn. And I just saw Chris on the air last weekend when I was in Gulf Shores. Chris is at NBC 15 out of Mobile, Alabama. He actually came down to the Gulf Shores AOPA event on Saturday, about the time that I had run up to see the USS Battleship Alabama. So we missed each other. But Chris, thanks so much for that review. And longtime listeners know that they can also hear this podcast on our dedicated app, which is available on iPhones through the Apple App Store. Just type in Aviation News Talk and you'll find our app. And here's a review that was left on that app by Antoine ATL. He says that he's recently got a CFI certificate and that he's already including some of the episodes within his training syllabus. He says there's great material, including things we talked about, the impossible turn, 20 things your CFI didn't teach you. And by the way, we've got listener feedback coming up in just a moment about that episode. And he says basically, thank you. He says, it's clear that safety is always your number one consideration. Antoine, you're very welcome, and thank you for that kind review. And for people that have Android phones, you can find our dedicated app in the Google Play Store. And here's a review that comes from Pilot Okieri, who, based on my little search on the web, looks like she's a lady pilot. She says one of the best flight training podcasts in the world. She says she's in Ghana and she really likes the work. Keep it up. Hey, thanks so much for your review. And especially if you have one of our apps, please go out and leave a review for us there to help other people find us when they are looking in the app stores for things about aviation. Now let's go on to listener feedback. These first two refer to episode 77, 20 Things Your CFI Didn't Teach You. And Jerry in Georgia says, just listen to your latest episode. If you get asked to copy a phone number and call ATC, I also highly recommend filling out a NASA form. Oftentimes, the controller will dismiss the issue. However, a supervisor may review the incident and subsequently report the incident to the FAA. Good point, Jerry. I hadn't thought about that. Thanks for sharing that. And this comes from Lyman here in California. I've flown with Lyman before. Regarding that episode, he says, Hi, Max. I couldn't remember what I felt was missed in my flight training until I heard your list. Agree with all of those. One additional weak area for me was the straight-in visual approach to towered airports. Lyman, I agree. We're going to talk more in detail about that someday. I think that's one of the weakest points I see with pilots. He says, so much of the practice was in the pattern at the traffic pattern altitude, and getting tower instructions to do long finals of varying lengths had me improvising at first until I settled into some descent rules of thumb for driving in level until intercepting a visual glide slope. Somehow it never came up in training. Yes, you're right. Straight-ins just don't get talked about in the private pilot training, unfortunately. Here's another email this comes from Shay in Oregon, also about the same episode. He says that he's based in rural Oregon, had little experience with controlled airspace, but then he flew shortly after he got his ticket to Boise, Idaho, which has 2 parallel runways. He says, I was told by approach to enter a right downwind for runway 28 right, and he said that everything was lining up as intended. He said, after switching to tower, I announced my position as entering a right downwind for 28 right. Everything was normal. On my downwind leg, ATC issued another instruction that they would call my base. No issues with that instruction, as I was able to make visual contact with the airplane on final that I was number 2 behind. He says, now, once on final for 28 right, I was issued an instruction to sidestep. I can't remember if there was anything more to the instruction. My pilot friend and I kind of looked at each other as to what this instruction was that they didn't expect. I was locked into the 28 right clear to land instruction and did not expect anything else from ATC until I was told where to exit on the runway and switch to ground. I knew intuitively what ATC wanted me to do, but yet it didn't register. I then looked ahead and saw the Southwest Boeing 737 holding short of 28 right, waiting for landing traffic, which was me. I knew then what to do, but before I was able to reply back to the tower, he issued the same instruction, but with a little more verbiage. He said, clear for 28 left, and when I radioed back, I said, Roger, sidestep, clear to land, 28 left. I landed with no issues. When studying for my private ticket, I remember reading about sidestep, but never discussed it with my CFI. We never flew into an airport with parallel runways. Really excellent point, Shay. Thanks for sharing that. Sidestep is something that's common on instrument approach plates, and so certainly instrument pilots become familiar with it. But you're right, I don't think we talk about it much in private pilot training. And here's feedback from a different episode. It comes from Eddie, who's one of our Patreon supporters. He says, love the show, Max. I work with several CFIs at Prior Aviation, where I'm working on my private in Buffalo. I always mention your show to them and other student pilots. While listening to episode 80, it struck me just how fortunate one is to fly. The college professor you interviewed, who is attempting to fly over 40 hours a week, has the resources most of us do not have: planes, money, and time. Yes, you're absolutely right, Eddie. That situation is certainly unique. I don't know of anybody else who's trying to fly 1,500 hours in 1 year or who could afford to. Eddie says, as someone who grew up in low-income government housing, I would love to hear how or if the aviation community is reaching out to the less fortunate in an effort to reach an untapped demographic. What are your thoughts on this subject? Eddie, really excellent comment, and I sent him an email back, and I told him that there are a lot of places that are offering scholarships. For example, we had a story here 2 weeks ago, which I put in my unused file just because we had so much other stuff to talk about that week, but FedEx announced that they are committing $2.5 million to aviation scholarships. That's really huge. And of course, Women in Aviation has provided over $500,000 in scholarships every year for many, many, many years now. And earlier in the update section today, I talked about Renee Brilhant, who had flown as a young eagle at age 13 and now at age 26 is flying for Republic Airlines. You remember her comment? She said, apply for every scholarship out there, start working, become an airport bum, and never stop learning. I'm still amazed that she was able to get to solo for just $250, but it just shows that there are many paths out there and there is some money available for people who are out seeking it out. And now here's a listener question from one of our Patreon super supporters who I met up with in Carbondale a few weeks ago. And we've got a listener question from Chris Carnahan.
Okay, here's my question for you, Max. If you've got parallel runways and you've been told to make traffic for the far side runway and you are closer to one that you're not in the pattern for that, should you be tracking for that downwind closer to the far runway or make your traffic through just the normal track that you would for the close runway and then extend your base when you turn for that other runway that's on the other side?
Great question, Chris, because I don't remember ever reading about this anywhere, but I typically fly a downwind that's anywhere from maybe 0.7 miles to about 1 mile offset from a runway. And at small airports, I may be in a little closer. At larger airports, I might be out a little further. But imagine we've got two downwinds on opposite sides of the parallel runways, each of them offset about a mile from the runway that's closest to those downwinds. When I'm flying downwind, I'm flying about the same distance from the runway that's closest to me, regardless of which of the two runways I eventually plan to land on. So as an example, if I'm at San Jose International, if I'm on right downwind, I'm flying a downwind that's about a mile away and parallel to the closest runway, runway 30 right. And I'm flying the same exact right downwind, regardless of whether I've been assigned to land on 30 right or 30 left. Now, if I'm assigned to land 30 left, that just means I'm going to be flying a longer base leg to get over to that side of the airport. But my downwind is still going to be in the same exact place about a mile out from 30 right. Now, the reason I do that is there may be jets departing off of 30 right. And if I decided to keep my right downwind in very close to runway 30 right, because I was going to be landing on 30 left, then I might be in conflict with the jets departing off of 30 right. So I always set up my downwind so that I'm about a mile away from the runway closest to me, regardless of which of the two parallel runways that I'll eventually be turning to land on. And hey, if you think that someday you might buy a new or slightly used Cirrus, please contact me today. I can help arrange a free demo flight for you if you're thinking about a new Cirrus and help you understand all the factors, not all of which are obvious in buying new versus used Cirrus. I specialize in the Cirrus and work with people literally around the world. And if you have a question you'd like me to answer on this show, please go out to aviationnewstalk.com, click on Listener Question so you can record your question when I'll play it on the show. Also, if you want to, you can just click on the artwork in your podcast player on your smartphone, and you'll find my contact information and a link where you can go to record a question directly from your smartphone. And if you would, just one thing, please, oh, please do this. Take just a moment. Tell one or more of your friends who you think might enjoy this show, if only they knew about it. Then go ahead and contact them today and tell them about the show. Because most people, frankly, find this show because someone like you took a moment to tell someone else. And if they don't really know what a podcast is, don't let that stop you. Just show them how to go out to the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store on Android and download our dedicated Aviation News Talk app. Just search for those 3 separate words. And until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.